conversation and take it further and just talk a bit more about gender-based violence and femicide in our country. And I'm joined by Research Associate at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, Lisa Vetten at Wits University. Good afternoon to you, Lisa, and thank you for your time as always. Among the themes coming through in that report by my colleague Tebogo is the issue of a protection order and a suspect and a person who was known to law enforcement across the board, various stages of law enforcement. How typical a theme is that in the way we grapple with gender-based violence and femicide?
Well, I think if you look at the research that has been done, we've been able to see that over the last 20-odd years, roughly 30%, or 1 in 3, of men who do kill their intimate female partners, there's a history of domestic violence in the relationship. And then there's a very small percentage, between 1% to about 5% of women who are attacked and murdered when they have a protection order at the time. So this case falls into that small proportion, very, very unfortunately. There should be obviously no murders that happen when you have a protection order, because, that is the purpose of a protection order, to protect you from further violence. So clearly we'd need to look more closely at this case to see if there was any kind of negligence involved, or whether there is something that we have to learn about what makes protection orders ineffective so that we can make sure that they serve their purpose better in future.
So part of the theme that came through, I think, in a speech that was delivered by President Ramaphosa at the ANC's NGC had to do with training of police officers for their understanding of how to treat reports when someone comes forward at the police station to report gender-based violence, and taking into account all of these factors, previous history, protection order, the existence of a protection order. How deep a need is that within the criminal justice system, that training?
Training is always helpful, but it is by no means the cure or the silver bullet that fixes the problem. I think while you do need to have trained officers, you also need to have a station culture that is responsive to domestic violence and thinks domestic violence is a problem. I mean, I've done research where you have stations where the victim empowerment position is considered to be the place where you dump the nuisance police officer who you think isn't very effective and you can't find a job for them to do, so you go and dump them in victim empowerment. Clearly, that person can be as well trained as they like, but if they're in a station that is not supportive, does not think this is an issue, you're not going to get a good and effective response under those circumstances. I mean, I also think that the police themselves don't use their own data effectively. I have never seen them ever produce data that shows they've analysed women who die with protection orders, that they've ever tried to look at risk assessments, and that they've ever tried to train their members in order to identify high-risk situations. And this will be important because there is a part of the Domestic Violence Act that still needs to come into effect nationally, called a safety monitoring notice. And those notices will be given to women who it's identified of being at particular risk of ongoing and increased violence potentially. So it's really important that we make sure that that new tool goes with the kind of training that is specialized and will enable officers to understand when they need to use this tool and when they need to be paying particular attention to a particular household.
And the National Strategic Plan Against Gender-Based Violence, how useful a tool is it in the states, at least the state's response, if we put aside, how it assists NGOs and civil society, but the state and actors in the state, including those in the criminal justice system? Lisa, I'm wondering, for example, is it being simplified and produced in, I don't know, graphic content, kind of content at station level, such that people are conscious and conscientize constantly that there is this strategic plan that is now guiding how we do things?
No, and I think one of the criticisms, certainly from civil society, has been that the strategic plan has not been sufficiently well publicized. Most people don't know about it. So, for instance, when there was a call for the national disaster, I didn't hear many people talking about, well, what do we need to do to strengthen the strategic plan in order to make it more effective? That conversation didn't really happen. I mean, I think the other difficulty with the national strategic plan is that in 2020, when it was developed, it had indicators and targets set, but only until 2024. So we're now about to start 2026. So that means we'll have been heading into an entire year where there hasn't been any, I think, real direction around the plan. I think what's also really important is that there was also an evaluation of the first 5 years of the plan. That needs to be made public so that people can see where the weaknesses are, particularly in the state, and for people like the police. I think, with this, the strategic plan is a broad brushstrokes plan. What the police need to have up on their walls and simplified is their national instructions that explain when you arrest without a warrant, when you remove a firearm, how you remove a firearm. That kind of material needs the very practical nuts and bolts of policing domestic violence. That needs to be simplified, put on big charts on the wall for every police officer to know and understand, and to be able to answer in their sleep. You wake them up and say what they need to do.
So that makes sense. That makes a great deal of sense to me, Lisa. But now let's talk about that declaration of a state of disaster. Initially, when the president made the announcement, it was on the 21st of November during that day of action that had been called across the country, which was a very powerful symbolic act that played itself out in the country. There was initial confusion about whether he had declared it gender-based violence a national disaster or a national crisis. And those words matter in that one has proper legal consequences and the other doesn't. It depends on political will. But we've since heard from Minister Velenkosini Hlabisa that actually it is national disaster. And I think a couple of days ago, the president also using that phrase, national disaster. Why is that important? What implications does it have?
Well, look, at this point, it's a very general guideline that's been issued with the classification of GBV as a national disaster. All it really says is that there must be more reporting to the National Disaster Centre as to departments' measures, and that people must accelerate their actions and coordinate better. That's very general. And on that basis, you can criticise it because it gives no new direction. For instance, it doesn't give extra funds. On the other hand, I think it is a challenge to all those who work in the sector to see this as an opportunity to say, well, what can we ask for? Because, when you have something that is as open as this is, it means you can actually determine and put quite a lot into what it is that you want to see happen. So I think it's a real challenge now for people to take this opportunity to say, these are the kinds of things that need to happen. So I, for example, would like to see the police do something about their femicide statistics. In the last 2 years, they have given 3 different numbers for the number of women being killed. That is of absolutely no use to us whatsoever if we are trying to determine whether or not the problem is getting worse or getting better or staying the same, and therefore whether or not our interventions are effective or not. So for me, an important intervention right now would be to get the police to explain why their statistics vary so wildly and what it is they're going to be doing in order to correct them so that we can make informed decisions and evidence-based decisions around what we do about femicide.
And in terms of, as we talk about the numbers and the police, there are many dimensions, naturally, Lisa, that we could, threads that we could pull at in this conversation. But I think one of them has to do with the number of incidents that actually involve officers themselves, especially femicide incidents. And I saw someone asking a couple of days, I think in the wake of yet another incident, if any work has been done to try and understand that dimension. How do we understand that dimension, the use of firearms by police officers in femicide incidents? What's our best understanding of that?
Well, actually, the problem is broader than the police. We need to be looking not just at the police, but the private security sector. We need to look at those who are in the SANDF, and we also need to look at Metro Police and correctional services individuals. Because when you start looking at applications for protection orders, that particular grouping appears quite frequently within their statistics. And I think the concern about them is that they have access to firearms in ways that the rest of society does not. So it's very important to understand why they are overrepresented and also why they are using state-issued or work-issued firearms in order to commit murder. So that's a very important piece of intervention that needs to happen. And in fact, there was some discussion earlier this week with the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority about what we do in the private security sector. So I think there are steps that can be taken. I mean, I'd like to know what the military, the SANDF, is doing. Police, we've seen some good guidelines emerging from them, but they're not enforcing their removal of firearms quickly enough and as often enough as we would like to see that happen. If I can add, and I mean, I think this is where you get into practical problems. One of the reasons why you don't always see the police removing firearms as often as they should from their police officers is because what it then might mean is that they don't have enough officers who can then go and work outside because they don't have firearms. That's a real practical problem that we then need to have to give some thought to, because obviously you do need officers out there policing and protecting communities in a whole range of different ways.
All right. Lastly, Lisa, I want us to come back to this declaration of a national disaster around GBVF. You and I have become familiar with what the implications are of a disaster declaration. Has that follow-through happened? The gazetting of regulations, or is this a different kind of national disaster that won't follow that pattern, that is accompanied by extraordinary regulation making, extraordinary decisive lawmaking, executive lawmaking that allows intervention in the here and now?
Well, they did gazette. And that's where, when I spoke earlier about them saying to accelerate existing initiatives, that's where they set it out. So I think they've said quite clearly there is no need for additional new regulations. And I must say, I would agree with them. What we need to see is better and more effective implementation of what exists. So I think it's really, as I was saying earlier, it's up to people now to seize the opportunity to state out very clearly what are the kinds of things we want to see happening. I mean, we're going to have the National Council on Gender-Based Violence established for the next couple of months. So I do think it's important that people give the thought now, say give content to that so it can be picked up by the council when it is appointed.
All right. Lisa, I've got to thank you. Just on a side note, does your cat have a name? You've got a very famous cat now who was joining in our conversation.
Yes, his name is Frank, and he says hello to all your viewers.
Famous cat there. Thank you for that. Lisa Vetten is Research Associate at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University.